All right, so everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining this webinar on the impacts of the climate crisis on migrants and workers. Since we're in a Zoom meeting format, I'd like to ask everyone to please keep your cameras turned off and your mics on mute. My name is Borislav Gerasimov, and I'm the editor of the Anti-Trafficking Review. This is the first open access peer-reviewed journal that focuses on the topic of human trafficking in its broader context and intersections with gender, labor, migration, and development. The journal publishes 2 issues per year, each of which is dedicated to a specific predetermined theme which we've identified as current or under-researched. And the journal is published by the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, which is an international network of over 100 NGOs worldwide that advocate for the human rights of migrants and victims of trafficking. Before I introduce our 3 speakers today, I'd like to provide some context for this event, this webinar. It's inspired by the most recent issue of the journal, which we published in October last year under the theme Climate Emergency and Work on a Heated Planet. So why did we choose this theme? I suppose everyone attending today is probably aware of what is happening to the Earth's climate, but I'll still share some very basic facts about the climate crisis before we move on with the webinar. So the past 10 years have been the hottest years since record keeping began, with 2024 being the hottest year, 2023 the second hottest, and 2025 the third hottest. If the current levels of greenhouse gas emissions continue, we will very soon breach the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise above pre-industrial levels, which was set by the Paris Climate Agreement. Some estimates actually suggest that the so-called carbon budget that the world has, this is the amount of carbon dioxide that the world can emit before breaching this threshold, will be exhausted in just 3 years' time by 2028. At the same time, global efforts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change are stalling. China, for example, has made huge progress in introducing renewable energy and reducing its reliance on fossil fuels. But the United States, as we know, is waging a war on renewable energy and climate actions, and its CO2 emissions are increased last year, largely due to the demand for AI data centers. The European Union is also scaling back its climate actions in favor of industrial development and economic growth and competition with the US and China. And more broadly, while tackling the climate crisis requires stronger international cooperation, we are actually living in a world of intense competition, unilateral actions, and complete disregard of multilateral institutions. In addition to that, the multiple senseless and illegal wars happening at the moment, such as Russia's war on Ukraine, Israel's war on Gaza, and the US and Israel war against Iran, are also having massive environmental impact. It's estimated that only the first 2 weeks of the US-Israel war on Iran have led to 5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The rising global temperatures lead to profound changes in the ecology and weather of the planet, such as soil erosion, water salinization, prolonged droughts, floods, and erratic weather patterns, as well as more frequent and intense natural disasters such as hurricanes and typhoons. These weather changes are felt by everyone, but not equally. The effects are felt most by people working in already precarious labor sectors such as agriculture, construction, fishing, and garment production, whose working conditions become unbearable under rising temperatures. They also affect people living in rural areas who earn their livelihoods from subsistence farming and fishing, which is also impacted by slow and rapid onset weather events. In many cases, people's homes and livelihoods are destroyed. Their only option is to migrate to cities or other countries to earn a living. And this pressure to migrate and to find work very quickly, makes them vulnerable to exploitation. So after this very brief introduction, which was the sort of rationale and the motivation behind publishing an issue on climate change, To discuss these issues in more depth and with specific examples from different countries, I'd like to welcome our three speakers. Denise Brennan is one of the co-guest editors of this anti-trafficking review special issue on climate change, together with Sally Yeh. Denise is a 2025-26 Harvard Radcliffe Fellow, where she is writing a new book titled Work on a Heated Planet. She is also a professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Georgetown University in the United States. Bethany Jackson is a Nottingham Research Fellow at the School of Geography and writes lab lead in decent work and climate change at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And Jimmy Bauman is a senior program manager at the Freedom Fund, which is an organization that contributes to global efforts to end modern slavery, partnering with frontline organizations and communities where exploitation and trafficking are highly prevalent. So I've prepared a few questions for our speakers, and we will try to finish our discussion maybe 10 or 15 minutes before the end of the hour, after which we'll have some time for questions and answers from the audience or for interventions. I see that in the audience there are other people I recognize who conduct research on climate and migration or trafficking and who work with migrants and workers or it would also be nice to hear from them. So my first question to all three of you, but we'll start with Denise, is based on your research and advocacy. How does the climate crisis impact workers, both local and migrant? Over to you, Denise.
Great. Thank you so much, Bobby, for setting us up. And also, thank you so much for the beautiful editing and the organizing around getting this special issue off the ground. I see some familiar names in the audience. So, we're all part of the anti-trafficking movement. And unfortunately, do you hear the echo, Bobby, or is that just me?
I don't.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're just not working with other justice movements that are still quite siloed, but particularly on this issue of the climate crisis, right? As the great abolitionist Mariam Kaba has said, anything worthwhile must be done in community. So let's consider today a launch of an ongoing conversation, which is why I wanted to have this journal host a special issue on the climate, is to kind of simultaneously launch a series of conversations in our respective regions. I see Chris Ash from the Freedom Network. It's my goal to work with the Freedom Network to get a working group going. But hey, Chris, and then also to think about a global conversation, right? Because worker justice movements, migrant justice movements, and the anti-trafficking movement, the decarceration movement, the demilitarization of border movements, they're all pretty, siloed, and for good reason. Everyone's on the run. I really appreciate that Bobby's kicked us off with some statistics. We know from scientists what the global thresholds are before, the planet cannot recover. We know how much the human body cannot endure. We don't need more science on how far the body can be pushed. So as the planet heats up, what I've been interested in globally and then domestically, since I work in the United States, and I've written a book called Life Interrupted on the first people in the United States, the first migrants to receive trafficking visas. And I also have written a book on border policing throughout the US. We know that the most vulnerable people, because of their incarceration history, because of the demands of parole and probation, and also because of their legal status, are extremely vulnerable or made more vulnerable by the climate crisis to accept really lousy work on lousy terms. Um, My interest in this honestly kicked off when I saw a photo of agricultural workers breathing in toxic smoke through their own jerry-rigged bandanas, smoke from a wildfire, Northern California, vineyards, famed wine country, wildfire encroaching. But these workers were issued access passes by local municipalities when everybody else in the area had been under a mandatory evacuation order. So it raises issues that the ILO handles about what is dignified labor. I, as an anthropologist, get very frustrated with these measurements of, or these human rights indicators of what is beyond the pale. You know, what is trafficking? I don't think we need these human rights instruments to know that nobody should be left behind during a mandatory evacuation. And nobody should be breathing in these particles that, as Hannah Dreyer's article from Page series in the New York Times in the fall emphasized with wildfire fighters, young, strapping men who are dying from these fast-acting cancers, that this level of exposure is lethal. I'm going to be academic for a second. It's not in a way that Rob Nixon has written about slow violence. This violence is immediate. It is visible, and it is preventable. So that's just one case study or one instance of what is happening in agriculture here in the US. Workers, of course, are on the beat. A lot of community-based organizing, worker organizing. I'm talking unpaid. These are not staff, asking for things like, believe it or not, wait for it, water breaks with enough water that lasts throughout the day and that stays cold. You can't drink hot water. Um, all the way to lobbying like vineyards and other employers for something called disaster pay. So if the crops burn or you can't pick, you get paid that day. Same with if there's flash flooding and fields are flooded. So you get the idea. Unfortunately, as I said at the outset, I think everyone is running. They're trying to stay out of ICE's way, immigration customs enforcement, which, as you know, is run rampant right now. And it's hard to think about what I'm calling the future of work, but I'm just constantly reminded about how the future of work is here. So I look forward to a lively discussion. This isn't supposed to be the panelists only talking. And then I really urge you to contact me if you're interested in an ongoing, let's just say like, you know, global working group on labor trafficking and migration. You can find me. I'm at Georgetown. Thank you. Oh, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Sorry.
Thank you, Denise. So let's move on to Jimmy. Your article in the issue, I put a link to the special issue in the chat for whoever hasn't seen it. But your article describes the working conditions in the Brazilian indigenous workers in the Brazilian Amazon. If you can tell us a bit more about this and anything else you'd like to share from your experience at the Freedom Fund.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Borislav. So just as background, I think there are people on the call that know a little bit about the Freedom Fund, but in case not, our work prioritizes getting funds to locally based organizations that are rooted within marginalized communities. And we think that those frontline organizations are closest to the people that are being exploited and have the most stake in what's going to happen. And it means that they have a better chance of creating good strategies to address the drivers of modern slavery. And it's really through that work with clusters of local organizations and through the accompanying research that we do that we can see the impacts of climate breakdown across a wide range of contexts and can see exactly how it deepens exploitation and contributes to trafficking risks. So our article, as Borislav mentioned, focused on just one of those contexts where the climate crisis is impacting work. Article, the leaders of one of our partners, Jolimia Desjagas and Dionia Ferreira, focused on our Amazon hotspot in Brazil. And the article looks at the disaster that's unfolding in their part of the Amazon. And we explored what it really takes for workers and communities to be able to protect their livelihoods and their forests, and to be able to resist slave labor, as it's called in Brazil. In other words, what needs to be in place to make that possible? So just to give background on what's happening there, in these remote river communities in Amazonas state, they depend on fishing from the river, gathering non-timber resources from the surrounding environment. And in the research that Jolimia and Dionia did, local people spoke about the mass death of fish in the overheated streams and dried up rivers, and of course the wildfires that are multiplying in the forest as the climate rapidly changes. And they talked about the worsening scarcity of drinking water and how that leads to waterborne diseases, and that these diseases are a much higher risk for them because of their remoteness from health facilities. And they're seeing the yields of forest products and small-scale crops are falling because of the unpredictability of the growing seasons. And then this is all set in a context of violent threats and seizing of land by illegal loggers and miners. And then the final twist in this situation is that workers from these same communities often then have no choice but to accept jobs to carry out deforestation and mining. And they're recruited into conditions that often meet the country's definition of slave labor. And this is happening because their traditional livelihoods have been exhausted by criminal incursions on the land and by climate change. And I hope that perhaps later I can talk a little bit about, well, what are people doing about this in this context? What are these workers doing? But I'll pause there for now.
Yes, thank you, Jeannie. I thought it was heartbreaking how exactly I see a comment in the chat that it's heartbreaking how when the climate destroys people's livelihoods and then they feel forced to participate in this economy that leads to illegal logging and worsens the climate crisis. Um, I'll pass on now to you, Beth, to share sort of the same uh, question, how the climate crisis is impacting workers based on your research. And your article specifically deals with the issue of decent work and the just transition, which again, everyone is welcome to read on the journal's website.
Thanks, Borislav, and to Denise and Ginny for setting the scene really nicely. So yeah, I think the work that we do and what we address in the article and other research is often focused around the impact of climate change through the lens of sustainability through the decent work agenda. And that's particularly relevant since the concept and idea of a safe and healthy work environment was introduced to the fundamental principles and rights at work at the international level in 2022. And we argue that a safe and healthy work includes being able to have work that means you're not exposed to the impacts of climate change. That obviously varies by different geographies, by different sectors, depending on what hazards you're exposed to and what that looks like in your day-to-day work. But we believe that's important because the Decent Work Agenda explicitly references the elimination of forced labor and child labor, and then the access to things around social security networks and wages and things like that. So all these elements are really fundamental to addressing access to decent work. And let's be clear, we define decent work as being the bare minimum standard of work that you should be have access to. It shouldn't be the thing we aim for, it should be the thing we aim to surpass, but it should be the bare minimum. So much of the research that we've done in this area has focused on India specifically in projects, particularly around the brick kilns, which I know Ginny has experience of at the Freedom Fund, looking at brick manufacturing in the northern states in India and the particular exposure to heat there with heat waves and being outdoors, working to mold the bricks, fire the bricks. So you've got that ambient air temperature and then the exposure of the heat from the kilns. And that intersectional element that Denise mentioned around how it connects with things like your access to education, your gender, your economic precarity, your access to land, your caste status in India, for example. So that's one element that we've been really looking at in terms of manual labor out in the outdoor exposure. And then currently in my present research, we're looking at how those intersections manifest in the food sector in the UK. So Denise mentioned a lot of the work that's been happening across the Americas, and Ginny as well, in terms of agricultural workers and migrant workers. And we're seeing the shift now in the UK in terms of where we access our labour from in terms of our food system after Brexit, with a shift in the migrant workers. But then also we're seeing a lot of exposure to increased temperatures in the UK, but also flooding is a real risk. And then there's the inherent exposure of sea level rise as an island nation. And whilst we talk about the risks to migrant workers in terms of their living and working conditions, very often it's not linked to climate change. And that's the sort of element that we're looking to shift at here from a more high income country perspective, so that all the really cool researchers that are happening locally can do all the cool stuff in India, and I can look at start working at home and sort of spread the balance. So yeah.
Thank you, Beth, for this overview. And of course, as I mentioned, your article focuses more on, well, in more depth on the different ways in which the climate crisis impacts workers in different sectors and what it means for the decent work agenda. And I'd like to add a little bit here. One of because the three of you mostly spoke about agriculture and other so-called land-based sectors, but one of the articles we published by Sally Ye, she looks at deep sea water fishing, I'm not sure, or deep water sea vessels, basically fishing, and how increased water temperatures, increased ocean temperatures, and water salinization means that the vessels that catch sea fishes need to go further, deeper into the sea, which means that then it becomes more expensive to return to stock on food and fresh water. So the fishermen, the workers on these sea vessels, sometimes actually have to drink seawater, which because of the increased water salinization, they now develop different kidney diseases and something that is apparently called beriberi, which I didn't know. But there have also been deaths of seafarers because of the specific challenges, the specific ways that deep water sea vessels operate. Of course, trying to save on costs because global consumers demand cheaper seafood, but also because of the impacts of the climate crisis and rising sea level temperatures. Now, my next question to all three of you is how the climate crisis impacts on migration. Um, and you all spoke a little bit about migrant workers, but again, if you want to add anything about how migrant workers are impacted when they are forced to migrate because of weather events. And now, again, give the floor first to Denise.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. I mean, a couple things come to mind which may not be obvious, which is uh, the pressures on migrants, right? Always to send remittances back home, and that migrants themselves may be experiencing climate-induced harms in their work sites as their loved ones back home are also experiencing, drought or, you know, harms related to climate. So that it's a pressure, right, that is felt differentially for sure, but that it is global. And I'll just speak briefly to what those who are familiar with Trump's um, anti-migrant policies that the crackdown on criminalizing immigration just means that across labor sectors where migrants labor, regardless of their legal status, frankly, so anyone basically who's not white and lives in a poor neighborhood and does low wage labor is altering their movements so as not to be on ICE's radar or to get caught in any kind of law enforcement raid. And so that we're seeing, what the same old story we know that happens to along a continuum of exploitation that I've written about in Life Interrupted. And that's silencing, that's not reporting. It's enduring everything from sort of everyday expected and accepted forms of exploitation like wage theft to more extreme forms like trafficking. Thanks.
Thanks, Denise. I would encourage you, we're not so many people in the webinar, and I would encourage if anyone from the audience would like to add something to the uh, things we are discussing, you can just raise your hand and I'm happy to give you the floor. In the meantime, let's move on to Beth and Beth again on the question of how the climate crisis impacts migration or migrant workers.
Yeah, so in terms of migration, I think it's important to note that increasingly migration is seen as a legitimate form of climate adaptation for some communities. That obviously very much varies on your experience. Where it's choice, it's very different from when you're being actively displaced or forced to leave. Um, in terms of work that we've seen, and I think Shakira's on the call. So hi. From our work with partners, including OCUP in Bangladesh, we've seen that the repeated exposure to hazard events really has an impact on how you can adapt, and that can often push communities into considering migration as more of an adaptive strategy than they would want to originally. And oftentimes that comes through seasonal migration. But that does, like as Denise mentioned, leave that burden on those that are essentially left behind to pick up additional work in the household. Um, and that can lead to sort of this stress multiplier effect of being able to respond, but not actively being able to adapt. And then I think in terms of those that are going to be displaced because we know it is going to happen and will be forced to migrate and potentially lose access to essentially the nation that's from where they're from. I think it's about how we make sure that you still have access to your human rights, and you're not then, because you're essentially stateless, you then lose what protections that you might have. And I think a lot of that will come from some of those government responses and how we address them.
Yes, thank you, Beth. So I'd like first, because while we were working on the issue, I got the sense that there wasn't always a very clear understanding, or that's what I heard from some of the authors, that some policymakers don't have a clear understanding of the sort of climate migration process or how the climate crisis impacts on migration. And I thought it was pretty obvious, but I guess it's worth noting that, the process is people's livelihoods or maybe destroyed if they are subsistence farmers and a drought comes along or a flood comes along and destroys their crops, and then they're not able to sell their crops. They don't have any money to live or to support their families. And then their only option is to migrate either to a nearby city or to a different country to earn a living. And similarly, if, a typhoon or a hurricane destroys their house and their village, and again, they need to earn money quickly to repair the their lost home or to support their families. Again, migration to a city or a different country may be the only option. So it's not like, people feel too hot or too cold in their local country and then they go on to migrate. It's the climate crisis leads to destruction of lives of people's homes and livelihoods, and this forces them to migrate when there are no local job options. So I wanted to sort of state this out loud for in case anyone is confused about the links between climate and migration. Okay, so Ginny, over to you if you'd like to add something on the impacts of the climate crisis on migration and migration.
Sure, thank you, Borislav. Yeah, so one of the other locations where we have a hotspot program, which is our way of doing interventions, is Southeast Nepal. And I'll use that program to give an example, which I think highlights a lot of the points that everybody else has made about migration. So over the last 11 years, we've been working there with groups of agricultural bonded laborers to organize at community, regional, national levels. And those groups start to gain access to other livelihoods. They collectivize as workers in their local area. They start to gain knowledge of their rights. And in many cases, those actions coming together help workers to be able to resist exploitation from the landlords. And it's actually the largest concentration of forced labor in Nepal, in southeast Nepal. And it's been affecting approximately 70,000 households that are controlled through debt. And technically, they've been freed from intergenerational bondage by a new law in 2022. It was a law that they achieved through their collective advocacy. But many still have to work in extremely exploitative agricultural work, very high levels of child labor, often unable to easily change employers. So those groups and movements are saying that the climate crisis has a huge impact on their efforts to move out of bonded labor and stay out of bonded labor. Most are living on flood-prone areas due to the lack of land rights on safer plots of land. And when there is flooding or droughts, these repeated climate shocks, as you mentioned, Borislav, move families deeper and deeper into trouble and debt. And the most common coping mechanism is for somebody from those families to migrate. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it's increasing, and it's increasing in the risk. So men especially have been migrating to the Gulf states and Southeast Asia, and they often have to get permission from the landlord to do that, from the families that they're controlled by. in order to migrate. And then if they're lucky, then the remittances help their family to cope, to get enough food, send children to school, maybe make payments against their debt to the landlord. But obviously, worsening climate conditions in these home communities mean that people are migrating under very risky circumstances. And then, as many on the call will know, these Nepali workers in construction in the Gulf are facing high risks of work in extreme heat that injures their health, or failure to pay the promised wages, or high risk of injury. Likewise, in Malaysia, in the factories, it's also characterized by high risks of forced labor. So effectively, what it means is that many of them are in forms of forced labor in the place that they migrated to, and they're also still in forced labor, their families, in their home communities. And the climate is a major contributor to the risks of modern slavery at both ends. And again, I'm happy to talk a bit more if we get time about, oh, but what are they doing about it? And, because I realize we're painting such a bleak picture here. It's a bit relentless, isn't it?
I just want to interrupt and say that I think it's important to not fall into that trope in so many, particularly academic settings, where people want to end on a note of hope, because it's unacceptable the way workers are being treated around the planet. These are thorny issues that will involve corporations, politicians letting go of profits. But there are some easy short-term fixes. So these are not rooted in hope, they're rooted in action and holding these structures to account. Sorry.
Thanks, Denise. No, it's okay. I mean, this was sort of going to be my next question. It's not exactly about hope only, but sort of like what are workers and communities doing to cope with the impact of climate change on workers and on themselves and migrants or their communities. And we can go back to you, Jenny. You can share something either from Nepal or from Brazil, which you discussed earlier.
Sure. Yeah, and I completely take your point, Denise. It is very irritating. Let's end on a note of hope. But I think, otherwise we structure it as these are just victims, they're climate victims, when actually they're doing a lot to try to put things in a better shape. So let me go back to the work in Brazil to give an example. So that we've got several partners there based in the Amazon that work closely with the communities affected by the forced labor and the loss of forestry and biodiversity. And those local partners link up with national level labor rights NGOs that we're supporting. So one example of that we gave in the article, we described an incident where members of a river community spotted ferry loads of workers passing through with tractors and excavators and materials for logging. And the local residents informed the NGO that Jolimia and Dionia work for, and through a series of connections, they were able to instigate a joint inspection operation by the Ministry of Labour and the federal agency responsible for environmental protection. And that inspection found 50 workers in conditions of forced labour. They'd been sheltering under tarpaulin for more than a month, no access to safe drinking water. They couldn't walk away. They cooked, bathed, and drank water from the nearby stream. They had no safety equipment. One had fractured his collarbone after a tree branch fell on him. And the destruction of forestry in this area was huge. It was estimated to be increasing at a rate of 10 football fields per day. So the inspector took the workers to the municipality headquarters. They had some immediate health care, and they were issued worker documentation so that they should get compensated. And I think it links with, again, what you were saying, Denise, about looking to government for solutions, looking to business. These are big problems. So that official inspection generates the publicity on available data about the existence of forced labour. Otherwise, it would just not be seen at all. It's reliant on reports from local groups. And it means that the owner is likely to go on the country's official dirty list, which should cut off some investment from the business. And our national partners then use that list to trace back through the supply chain to the international businesses purchasing from those companies. So then other legal, media, and consumer tools can be used to create accountability. And what we find to make that locally driven approach successful, you need communities that can trust the local NGO, which they could in this case, they were well known. The community members need to understand and reject forced labor and have the language that their country uses in its laws. And they need to have investments in livelihoods so that they don't have to resort to exploitation, and can bolster their resistance. And they also need to know what are the risks. If we do something about this, how are we going to be protected? Because the criminal enterprises have co-opted very powerful allies, and they will try and terrorize people. So they need safe channels to report. So that's just one example of what's going on in one location.
Thank you, Ginny. I see we have a raised hand by Pratima Sambaji. Pratima, would you
Hi.
like to you can introduce yourself and
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pratima Sambaji. I'm an academic from the University of Strathclyde, and great to join you. Really, very, very interesting, talks today. I wanted to talk about, like, just share two views that I've been sort of, contemplating. And I have had discussion with Shakirul from OCUP as well. Hi, Shakirul. I know the ILO is pressing for this concept of transformative skills for communities. Like, what sort of skills can we equip coastal communities, for example, to go into other directions of work? Now, I know in Bangladesh there's some projects going on which OCUP is involved in. So that's kind of, I wanted to know whether how effective can this be in terms of really addressing those short-term solutions that Dennis mentioned earlier, or is this just a blanket cover-up of the real problem? So that's one, and so I really want to know your views on this. Now, the other one is I've recently completed a small project on Mauritius. I am originally from Mauritius, small island, and the fishing communities there, they are suddenly being especially the artisanal fishers, both men and women, they are being told that they can no longer do artisanal fishing. So there are no permits being renewed or anything. Now, this is sort of intersecting with the climate change, related issues with the lack of fish, rising water temperatures. So this is sort of happening, but at the same time, the government is allowing commercial companies to fish in the outer sea, which is again another tension. But alongside that, there's also other industries that are developing in order to convince those coastal communities to take up other jobs. Like, for example, there's now these multinational hotel chains that are all over the island. So people are now contemplating either they migrate, go somewhere else. The island is too small to move to the city. There's no, it's too small. You either go somewhere else, or you end up forgetting your craft, what you wanted to do. You've done all your life, and you go and work, in the hotels as, obviously very low skill jobs, because they may not have the kind of the education that would put them in higher jobs. So there's this complicity of the state that you see in it, and it's quite disruptive. So there's on one side the ILO's wanting to transform skills, but then there's also governments who are trying to transform people's skills and putting them into other industries that potentially could be also culprits in this whole climate change. debate. So this is just a bit of my reflections from some recent talks and experiences I've had.
Thank you, Pratima.
Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond to this intervention or to questions of Pratima?
I don't mind jumping in. They were all really great questions, Pratima, so thank you. I think in terms of the the fishing community, I think that's something that we hear about a lot, as well as climate change is obviously making fishing harder. But yeah, the use of large fishing fleets, and there are a couple that I can think of off the top of my head that are extremely problematic. Um, I think I don't have a necessarily a solution to either of your questions, but I think it's really important that there needs to be concerted effort and funding from those that have historically driven climate change, but that funding is not implemented by Western norms, or this is how you do climate adaptation, this is not how you do it. Whether that comes in the form of reparations or, I mean, there's all kinds of problems with loss and damage funding at present, right? But I think there is a way of, there needs to be some kind of accountability. I say, as I sit in the UK, right? Like we are a big player in that. Um, and but that not necessarily going to those governments, but being fed into those local programs that Ginny mentioned, being able to find creative solutions that are often already present in local communities, but are essentially sidelined because there's, some great big concrete scheme that you can do instead of learning from the histories that people have been doing for centuries, and using that local and indigenous knowledge and really drawing on that. And I think there needs to be a real rebalancing. And so it's not really an answer to the questions. I think that there's an element for, upskilling in some ways, but I don't think it's the only answer. I think it's part of an answer that needs to go alongside all of that other stuff. So yeah, I think I
Thank
also
you.
think about it a lot, Pratima.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jenny or Denise, do you want to add anything here?
I would just add that, I think there are funders and organizations that rely on skilling as a not too difficult thing to fund compared to something like getting communities and workers to have a voice and be organized in the places that they are. And if you do one without the other, you're not going to bring about the kind of just transition that I think is what, say, the ILO might want there. And then it does need to also go alongside changed government policies, and both, not militarizing borders, but also the kind of economic movement that Bethany was talking about, where we start to address the gap in adaptation funding, not just give a tenth of what's needed, but much, much more, so that people have got a chance of adapting, and investing in locally led adaptation that I know people on this call are very good representatives of.
Yeah, and also, I mean, obviously these need to be well-paid jobs and jobs that the workers themselves want to engage in. I somehow, started thinking about how in so-called main anti-trafficking work, women who are quote unquote rescued from sex work are reskilled into making jewelry or being hairdressers or something else. In other words, given some other kind of, way to work that often pays them less than what they used to do sex work, to earn from sex work, but it's considered reskilling. Although I'm not saying the ILO is trying to do the same thing, it's just something that um, came to mind. Daisy, I see Daisy has raised her hand. Daisy, you can unmute and turn on your camera.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, it was just a quick question, actually, just to go back to something that you had said a little bit earlier, Ginny. So I have recently been doing some research into trafficking for forced criminality in Latin America. And so talking to some of our members at GATW in the region about how that's happening. And they've been telling us that it's mainly happening to adolescents. And it's really interesting to hear from you about your, did you call it your Amazon hub or your cohort or something like that of what's happening there, because a lot of the groups that I've spoken to have mentioned that region as being a region susceptible to Indigenous youth, particularly being susceptible to trafficking for forced criminality. But it's the climate change aspect of it is actually not an issue that has come up or that we've turned our mind to yet in my research of it. So I just wanted to ask if you've heard or seen. I mean, I know it's a really complicated situation in terms of like who's running the show there and the cartels and organized crime and things like that. But I was just wondering if you'd seen any sort of trafficking for forced criminality or adolescents being forced essentially out of that environment due to what you're saying, the climate crisis, and then the flow and effect from that being, sorry, it's very late here, but I hopefully understand what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think looking at the Amazon context in Brazil, it's a mixture of local people from these river communities who are being pulled into it, I mean, it is forced criminality. You know, it is illegal work to cut down the rainforest and to do this informal mining. But then it's also people from other parts of the country. And it's not mostly adolescents, it's young men that are brought in. So I'd be interested perhaps to have a one-to-one about, you know, which countries you're talking about and which
Yes.
which forms of forced criminality, whether it's drug movements or,
Yeah.
you know, just to know a bit more about specifically what you've been hearing.
Yeah, that'd be
So
great. I
maybe
might shoot you an
Borislav will
email.
help us
Yes, great.
tweet.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. We have a few minutes left, around 5 minutes. So I'd like to give you again the floor to three speakers for maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes each for some final words. Either you can share, for example, if you'd like, yeah, you can speak to what must be done, what governments must do, or what communities need to do, or NGOs. I don't know, any kind of closing arguments. Denise, would you like to start?
Yes, just as a reminder, I put in the chat my email about joining a working group. I don't know why I didn't put my email in originally when I was like, find me at Georgetown. Goodness gracious, Bobby. Look, I'm an anthropologist. I spend time with local communities. I love how everyone's work here and point of analysis has continued to echo that we need to bring to the table to shape policies of the most directly impacted people, and they need to be at these tables not to exchange trauma stories, right? But as experts, and those are that, you know, it is these local communities that are on the front lines of climate change that have created. I'm not going to use like climate transition language, but they've just created strategies to stay safe and to keep trucking on, right? Like to make an income. It's so many different fights in so many different places, right? Because the government structures are so different and corporate dastardly practices and accountabilities are so different. But I think making worker justice and migrant justice and decarceration as a labor issue, right? Since there's so much forced labor in the United States that is experiencing intensification of harm because of heat. But just, I think getting those entangled crises on the agenda of unions, of sort of obvious allies as they try to push the levers of local and national governments. And then I'm at a loss. We are in like the realm of Octavia Butler and like speculative dystopian fiction about how we get some kind of global pact, right, to protect people and the planet. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Louise. If any final words from you?
Yeah, sure. I think there's definitely some good work being done increasingly in the union space, particularly sort of taking back the co-opting of just transition by business. I mean, it originated in the union movement, and sort of being able to address heat. And there's a lot of good workers' organizations that are sort of addressing these types of work. I think of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and their heat safety plan. That's if in doubt, always go to the Fair Food Program. Um, but I think what really sort of drives me as particularly as the funding gets harder, policy is being stripped back, conflict is leading people to abandon pledges around aid and this sort of rapid transition that I mean it's been talked about in the UK around sort of getting off dependency on oil. Is thinking about that how we can do this cross-sectionally, as Denise mentioned. And I know Chris is on the call as well, so I'm thinking of collective threads of how we can make a movement that is recognizing all these types of injustices, and I think of climate justice in this case, and how do we make sure that we're addressing all of those issues together as a collective, learning from each other to pursue social justice that encapsulates all of those things. And I think there's lots of people doing all the good work and having those great creative and radical ideas, and maybe we need like a little bit of infiltration into the governance, because that's where some of the policy might get changed. Because we're like lots of people are doing cool stuff in those communities, and it's how do we get those people to listen, I think. But yeah.
Thanks, Beth. Before I give the floor to Jenny for a few final words, I also want to add, because both of you spoke about the need for building coalitions and connecting different movements. We have one of the calls for papers that we have going on at the moment, or we're accepting submissions at the journal, is for an issue on the theme of solidarity across silos. So we'd like to find out how, different movements, different groups of workers, different marginalized communities build solidarities to fight against marginalization and oppression. So the deadline is December, and we encourage, people who work in this area to submit articles. And the other issue for which we are also accepting submissions now is on engaging impacted communities. In other words, how people that are impacted by policy, whether they are workers or migrants or survivors of trafficking, participate in the development and implementation of that policy. So the calls for papers are on the journal website, and anyone interested is welcome to submit. And Ginny, you have the last word.
Thank you. That's very kind. I don't have a lot more to add. I think Denise and Bethany have said it really. I just think that this work at the intersection of climate adaptation and modern slavery can be really effective and important, and that we can develop some really good models from that of what could take us forward. We know what the bad models are for transitioning at the moment, but I think there's some good work can happen there, especially if we're all looking at those issues of coercion and control and what will change that picture at the same time as addressing climate. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the three speakers, Jenny Bauman, Bethany Jackson, and Denise Brennan. And thank you to everyone who attended. This was our webinar. We'll stay connected in different ways, I'm sure about this. Like I said, the journal issue on climate change is available on our website. It's free to read, and I hope we'll stay in touch for different reasons. Bye now. Have a great day.
Thanks, Bobby. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.